Hi, everyone, and welcome to our little round table. My name's Joce Brooks. I'm the Psychology Education Lead at the FA. I'm joined by Ian Mitchell, who's Head of Performance Psych and leads the Men's Seniors team, and Claire Davidson, who also is part of that team, working with the under-21s and under-15s, but they're going to introduce themselves shortly. We're going to be focused on what mental toughness is, what it isn't, and how we go about what indicates mental toughness, what's important about it, and briefly how we look to develop it. But first of all, my background's in performance psychology for about 25 years, working with professional teams and Olympic and Paralympic athletes and teams. Mitch, do you want to give a little potted history about your background, please?
Yeah, sure. In a previous life, I was a player, believe it or not. So I played professionally at a sort of young age, and schoolboy and international schoolboy, and then experienced an injury which instigated my interest around stress, resilience and support. So I did a PhD in that, taught in education for about 18 years in higher education, and was director of sports science and a senior lecturer in sports psychology. Alongside that, I did a lot of consultancy and work in academies and with the FAW, and did my A license, was a coach, grass-based coach throughout the development pathways with the Wales international teams. But alongside that, did a lot of work in coach education for 20 years around the pro licenses and A licenses. So fortunate to do some good work around that, and then decided to come out of education. Went full-time in the Premier League, worked in a technical department with the senior team and also the academy. And also alongside that, worked with Wales senior national team for 4 years, going through a Euro qualifiers, the Euro tournament in 2016, and the World Cup qualification campaign. So after all of that, joined England and the FA, and like you said, just been supporting the men's senior team with Gareth and Steve for the last 18 months, 2 years, and then also got a great psychology department who look after all 16 national teams as well.
Brilliant. Claire, welcome.
Hi, so I'm Claire, similar to Mitch, started off playing, then came out of that world and was really, really lucky to get a fantastic opportunity at Loughborough to study and really grow my interest in psychology. At the same time as that, I started out in an academy at MK Dons and just fell in love with the world of psychology and the impact that it could have working with coaches, working with the MDT and working with players to really help them fulfill their potential. In the 8 years post that, I worked in first team men's football in a range of different clubs supporting them, whether it ranged from like match day, training days, post-match, a whole range of things. And then now I'm back. I'm at the FA, and I originally started really focusing on the younger age groups when I first came in and really looking into what was the best environment and what's the best support for those younger age groups. And then now I'm back with the older age groups with the men's 21s, but also still supporting the men's 15s, which I absolutely love.
Brilliant. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at 4 areas then, and we're going to start with what we think mental toughness is, which is always a very important when you're considering how we move it forward. So what it is and what it isn't. So if you want to join in with us, then you might want to make a few notes as we go through. I'll pose you some questions as we go along. So in terms of what it is and what it isn't, when I ask this question a lot on courses, often you get a response that looks fairly similar to the right-hand side of the slide. So a lot of people talk about, confidence, being able to perform under pressure, bravery and courage, being able to regulate, but also some other kind of constructs come up around resilience, grit, and growth mindset. Mitch, do you want to talk to us about, so the definition we all kind of agree on. There's often many definitions of what mental toughness is in the popular literature and the academic literature. We don't really want to labour the point too much on the academic literature, but do you want to just talk to why you like this definition and perhaps the difference between that and some of the other constructs on the right-hand side?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important to start off with to have a definition of anything if you're going after something. And we spoke earlier about the physicality side of things, so be really clear on what we're going after. On the right-hand side, you can see there's a lot of terminology that you could start to talk around: mental toughness, resilience. We know probably resilience is around that ability to withstand pressure and promote some type of use of personal strengths to be sort of successful over time. Those types of things could include confidence, maintaining focus, competitiveness, maintaining high standards, optimism. And there are really a lot of things that you can start to see in grit around perseverance, drive, having a high self-belief, this pressure that keeps on coming in and trying to remain buoyant, for example, and keeping your head above water. And there's a control element as well, and also that growth versus static mentality really is slightly different. I always like the resilience piece because resilience is probably that emergent outcome that characterizes functioning in terms of sustaining healthy levels or bouncing back from adversity to come back to a normal sort of equilibrium or homeostasis, whatever you want to call it, after adversity. Whereas I think the mental toughness is more around focusing solely on that psychological capacity of an individual or a resource that you have at hand. So the definition we've used, or I tend to use Dan Gucciardi's definition, and there's many out there, so we just need to be wary of that. There's a few things in there. We the definition I like because it tells us that it's sort of state-like. So when I think about mental toughness, I like to think of describing a player who's under pressure and has demonstrated some form of mentally tough behavior. What is it that we're actually seeing? Now, that state-like tells us that can change. It's enduring, but it's definitely situational. It will change over situations. But the degree to what it manifests itself comes down to the individual's capacity to use that sort of resource or skill set. So definitely state-like, and there's a big debate around whether that's nurture or nature or dispositional or trait-like, but it's definitely a resource that highlights a potential for action. We know that it's valued when we're working towards some type of goal-directed behavior, whatever that might look like. And that could be in a performance context, it could be in your house as a lifestyle context, or well-being or health. So there's that type of aspect in there. But the other bit is it definitely encapsulates some common psychological dimensions around one purpose, some type of adaptability. We have to change and adapt to changing circumstances, and efficiency. So, for example, a focus of attention or concentration. If we haven't got that efficiency in focusing on relevant cues, then we're wasting energy and time and effort on other things. So that mental toughness aspect kicks in there. So that's why I like that definition.
Right. Claire, can you talk us through what you think it's not, please?
Yeah, I think probably from the name mental toughness, it's really easy to assume that it might mean that you have to be able to be really tough, almost like a rock where, whatever's happening, it just bounces off you. You might have to go it alone, and you might actually have to push down any of those, what might be perceived as negative emotions that you might experience. And that's absolutely not the case with mental toughness. Mental toughness isn't about any of those things. It is actually, while it can be a short-term coping mechanism to maybe go down some of those routes, actually we know that long-term that's really negative. And mental toughness is actually more about learning, getting the support you need to help you keep going towards those goals.
Brilliant. So there's some core things that come through here, but key, I think, is I'm picking up that actually you need to have one if you're considering looking at developing mental toughness in your players, and also being clear about what that is and what actually are the things that make it up. Okay, so when we then consider, and what's really important here is what are the psychological demands. So we divide these demands into kind of two things. We look at what are the general demands around players, and then we also look at what are the psychological demands in and around and of the game. So very briefly, so we know, so depending on what age and stage you're working with, we know that the growth and maturation piece can be a demand on players. We know that the schooling aspect, the academic aspect can be. We know that travel can be, home life, environment, other issues. What else have you guys experienced in the world's areas that you work that play into some general demands that they face? Mitch, do you want to go first and talk about some of the stuff that you're noting when your senior players are coming onto camp, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think, like you say, there's a cluster around some of the general aspects of stresses that a lot of high-profile top athletes would face across sports. There's definitely higher level scrutiny at senior level in terms of the expectation of delivery, and particularly the success that's gone on over the last few years with Stephen Gareth in charge, and the expectation of the group itself, and rightly so, and external around media. So you're going to have those types of things around to think about. I think so that could be one particular demand. I think players at the higher level, particularly those involved in Champions League, could be playing games every 3 or 4 days mainly, and then coming to an England camp it could be quite onerous and demanding because of fatigue around physicality. That would be something that I would deem quite demanding for senior players. There's also just, I think, the high level of competition that you get in clubs at the moment, and competition for places. People coming in, you want to represent England, you want to do well, you want to make sure that you're better than the person who's in your place. So there's a high level of competitiveness around that. So all around that, there's commercial side of things, the demands that have on players. There's social media, there's demands on that. So it's quite engrossed, or what I would say marinated with a number of demands that cross over generally from lifestyle away from family and friends to high competitive situations and performing environments to real specific aspects that we talk about on the grass.
Yeah, and then also that I suppose for a lot of younger players, aren't they possibly going full time within the game? Then they're no longer the big fish in the small pond. Perhaps they've moved levels. The fear of failure element coming through, which we see across, don't we? Doesn't matter if you're a young footballer or coming into a camp with the senior men's team. You're seeing that, aren't you? The fear of failure part.
Sorry, yeah. That's and we talk about identity, particularly right the way throughout the pathway. What do England teams represent? Who are we, and how are we seen internally as a group and also externally? So, we're one of the most diverse nations, in the world, I guess, and what individuals bring in shouldn't be a hindrance. It's a competitive advantage for us. So, whether that fear narrative is around in terms of expectation or fear of failure, maybe qualifying for competition, or maybe not going through a penalty shootout, or maybe not getting to a semi, whatever that is, then we've got a real sense of identity of who we are and how we want to represent England when we play.
Claire, can you just give us a snapshot into, I know you've done a lot of work in looking at your players coming into camps, both women's and with the men's pathway. Do you just want to give us a snapshot, key things that you're seeing, and what also you're then kind of doing to make sure that your players are stretched?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of the challenges are similar to ones you've said, but obviously there is the natural bit around when they first come in, that pressure of like, oh, I'm on an England trial, or, I'm playing my first international game, or any of those bits just is such a pressure for them. We also know that they do a lot of comparing at this age. They really do compare themselves, like, what do I look like physically? Am I as quick as him? Can I do the trick that he can do? There's a huge amount of comparing that goes on at that age naturally. But actually, when we looked at it, we also looked at, okay, right, these are the challenges we know they experience. But actually, if we want to prepare them, maybe short term, going to an under 17s Euros or an under 17s World Cup, where, for example, in the one where England won it in India, the average attendance for each game was 40,000, and that's 16-year-olds playing in front of 40,000 people. Or actually long-term, preparing them for the first team, where we all know the expectation that exists around the England teams every time there's a Euros or a World Cup. And what we always say is actually we don't know how quick they're going to move through that pathway. You've got someone like a Callum Hudson-Odoi that went from under 15s to seniors in 4 years. Or you've got someone like a James Ward-Prowse who did it in 8 years. But whether it's 4 or 8 years, we want them to be ready. So some of the things we look at is actually, okay, what do we need to be preparing them for? So we're very open in the under 15s about talking to them about winning and the pressure to win. But then alongside that, building up the skills to develop that winning mentality. Another example might be that in the international window, in the international game, we know you're going to get exposed to a whole different range of playing styles, and it can really, really vary. So we try and expose them to that at a very early age. So, for example, this year, unfortunately, it got cancelled due to COVID, but we were actually taking them to Pinatar, where we would have been playing your Brazils, your Spain and your Japans, which offers such a diverse range of opposition and playing style and what they're going to have to be able to adapt to, but also be able to respond to. So it really is a mixture when we look at these younger age groups about, okay, what do we know is naturally occurring? And actually, what do we maybe need to create, because we know it's important for them to experience exposure to stuff that they're going to experience later on.
Is there anything particularly from what you were looking at through the women's pathway that stands out in difference or on top of what you were talking about there?
Yeah, one of the big ones that I think is different in the women's, and I think this is perhaps due to the exposure they get at the different academies, is homesickness is something that's really, really difficult within the women's under 15 side, and something that we look to provide a lot of support around. A lot of the young boys that come into the men's 15s, they've maybe gone on international tours, or they've gone on away trips with their teams, but the girls seem to have a little less experience around that. So that's, for example, an area that we're really, really aware of and that we would support. But there's lots of different examples, but that's probably one of the key ones that springs to mind.
Great. So alongside those general demands that players are facing, we also know that the game poses many challenges. So around overcoming disappointment, being able to reflect quickly and adapt, refocus, an ability to keep going, even if it's not going your way. So, Mitch, can you elaborate a little bit more about how you look at this element when you're thinking about kind of designing what you're trying to get these players' capacities to look like?
Yeah, I think it's, the most important thing to emphasize is that the psychological aspects that we're talking about are not any different or separated from the physicality, the technical and tactical aspect, and coaches are fully aware of this. So when we talk about, for example, building the attack on the left-hand side, so how we play, the right-hand side, we would probably say, what do you need in this particular phase of play? What's really important? So coaches would look at how intelligent are players to have understanding and around the dominance of possession, for example, or when do they know when to decide or make a good decision to break lines? So from phase 1 to phase 2, from building the attack to creating the attack. So where the players, can we see players who are confident and stepping into spaces to receive the ball, for example, or playing really high intensity or ball pace for passing? And then how do we see certain players regulating emotion? So are they calm and composed in possession? Are they shouting and screaming, or are they actually scanning and looking for the press that's going to come in against them, for example. So this is all, when we talk about mental toughness that we're talking about today, that's goal-directed behaviour. So when a goalkeeper has got a ball, then the goal is to get the ball from the first phase to the second phase, to the second phase to the third phase. So there's some goal-directed behaviour in that we're looking at. And we would expect somebody who's displaying mentally tough behaviours to understand how they're going to get pressed. So are they scanning and aware of, is it a full press? Is it a sort of standoff press, so it's not high pressure? Who's rotating in front of me? So if I'm a centre-half receiving the ball on the right-hand side, is my full-back pushed on to create some space for me to receive the ball? Are there rotations in front of me in terms of my pivot or my deep-lying midfielders? Are there sort of some unselfish runs that are taking players out of positions for me to go into? So those types of things, we can tell that whether players are demonstrating those behaviours, and through those behaviours, we can more or less assume that there's some good thought process going around, and they're really understanding some of the key aspects of just a simple phase of building the attack, or whatever you want to call it. Are we looking at some really good positive behaviours, or are we seeing people who are perhaps a little bit too emotional, or staying away from the ball and not coming into good spaces to receive the ball? So perhaps they're not confident in that particular time of the game. And so how do we help that? And the coaches recognize this. They see this all the time. So we just start to help in planning and design sessions. What do we look for? What are we going after? And what are the sort of behaviors that we would observe to recognize good mental toughness, or perhaps not so good?
So I think a key thing here is, in order to work out how we're going to develop it, we've got to look at what the demands are. We've got to shine a light, haven't we,
Sure.
at the game, and see what capacities they need in order to thrive within that, don't we?
Yeah.
Before that will tell us how we can begin to, what indicates their, I suppose, the level of toughness, doesn't it, that they're displaying at any one time or another. And then we can move on to how we develop it.
I think it's that capacity, you're right, absolutely, to tap into that resource at that particular time. So.
Yeah. Have you got anything that you want to add here, Claire?
No, I think Mitch has covered that really, really nicely.
Okay. So then if we look at, so this is a little bit now trying to identify what we're actually looking for. Now, you know, there's a large resource that within the literature, within the popular, within books and stuff that talk to you about what components of mental toughness differentiate elite performers. So there's a couple of studies, and also there's a body of work that looks at what factors allow some players to make that transition from academy to first team, for example. So we know that self-awareness is quite important. We know that having people's coping resources are important, the level of optimism, their goal direction, their focus. But also there are, I suppose, if you're an individual athlete, there are going to be certain characteristics that are going to be more important for you than if you're playing a team sport. But generally, through the research, there are some key things that are consistent differentiators between those who are repeat medalists and those that are medalists, and those that don't, I suppose, have as much success. And it's important to bear those in mind, as well as looking at the demands of the game that you're playing. Mitch, could you just kind of, I suppose, give a summary thus then of what within the England pathways you think are important?
Yeah, I think you've mentioned a few things around. There are a lot of characteristics out there, but it's important that we start to highlight the key sort of differentiators that we feel are important. Otherwise, we're going to be working with a broad brush. So we like the aspects around drive, where people are really focused on a goal and persistent to achieve that goal. And we spoke about that earlier on. That level of conscientiousness seems to be a key one. So staying on track, or being aware of where you are and what you need to do to really achieve and be successful. We know regulation is key in terms of emotional regulation and attention as well. So keeping composed and calm in critical situations is something that we would look favorably upon for player development. The openness, we see this through the pathways, particularly the curious mind, the curiosity, the ability to ask good questions, and to receive feedback in a really open and honest and critical way. So we see that as key in terms of learning and development, particularly. And then we talk about that confidence, that unshakable confidence in the big moments. So how do we, that seems to be a real key differentiator. And we've seen numerous examples of that recently in high pressure situations, in penalty shootouts, in key moments of game where, it's a real sturdy, steadfast sort of situation where people are confident and they are successful to execute at a particular moment or time. So I think those are some of the things that we would look at, which resonate really strongly with resilience and toughness.
And alongside resonating with resilience and toughness, they also resonate, don't they, to the context you operate within. Also sort of the game model and the philosophy that sits around the England pathway, which is also really important when you're thinking about mental toughness development, isn't it? It's got to align with what you're about and what you believe in, presumably.
Absolutely. And I think that's key. We talk about some of the real key things when we talk about, the motivation. If we are going to develop this type of thing, then the motivation to succeed is really important, which we'd expect coming through the door of an international sort of organization. We have to have some type of pressure or adversity in context around a psychologically safe environment. So you're absolutely right. But the coach support and the coach philosophy has to really underpin that. And we're very fortunate that we've got ourselves conscientious and open coaches who understand this and the importance of this work. The key thing is how we embed that so it doesn't become a bolt-on. It's totally embedded in a model that's underpinned psychologically.
Brilliant. So once we've established what these characteristics are, then obviously our minds begin to turn to how is it indicated, and how do we recognize it? And that's not only just as in the role that we play, isn't it? It's how the MDT or the staff and the coaches actually also are able to, I suppose, observe those characteristics. So we know there are different measures out there that are either appropriate or not, depending on the age and resource that you have available. So we know that the paper pencil tests are there, whether or not they actually help us. But also we also know that our eyes are a great tool, aren't they? So could you, Mitch, just talk us through this body of work?
Yeah, I mean, there's, it's been at the forefront of my philosophy, particularly. And I know Claire is very similar in terms of working around behavioural markers. So this recent research that has come out, probably I was observing and others would be observing if they're working with teams probably years ago, but this sort of confirms it. So it all depends where you are. I mean, I've been very fortunate in terms of the resource available where we can get analysts coding behavioral aspects of players on a day-to-day basis in training, in games, or, we get, for example, 360 cameras or drones going up that we have access to sort of certain angles that are unobtrusive. So we get all of that, but basically it's down to, okay, can we see what types of behaviors that we would probably think are representing mentally tough players? And so it would be this type of thing. So what, consistency in behavior. So are we seeing consistent optimism, a successful mindset, for example, confidence after perhaps we've lost a game? So what happens on the Sunday when we come in for recovery sessions or bridging sessions on a Monday? Are we still seeing consistent behaviors that are still driving towards a goal that we're after, or we've really defined and explicit about? Or are we seeing people who are quite emotional, people who are quite selfish and not team supportive? Are we seeing players who are comfortable with accountability and people who need to be responsible? So it might be leaders who we've asked to lead and help junior members of the team, but certain days that they're not on it or they're off it. So the type of those behaviors, we're pretty clear that could define what we think represent mental toughness. So what are those mental tough behaviors that we would really see on a day-to-day basis? And this is a really good example of some of those behaviors that we would code and then perhaps filter back down into intervention work through coaches.
So a good example, many of you will be aware of the 5 C's model that was developed about 10 years ago. We still keep that within the FA, although it's not now really, I suppose, a core driver of mental toughness, I guess, but they're very easily observable, those 5 C's. So if you want a starting point, they're a good place to go. Claire, from your experience across the age groups, then, is there anything, any examples here from about observables that you think are really important?
Yeah, 100%. I think, we're really fortunate. We've got a whole range of resources that we can use here. But actually, if you haven't got that same setup or you haven't got those same resources, actually some real key ways that you can see it is actually how quickly do they respond and get back to what they should be doing in a game after they've made a mistake or something hasn't gone the way they'd wanted, or maybe a bad decision's gone against them. Or actually, what is their response immediately to that situation? What does that look like? There's some real easy ways you can kind of look at what's going on the pitch. But what I always add with this caveat, and I think this is the caveat I always add to this, is that that's just where they're at now. So at the minute, it may be that at the minute when she gets badly tackled, she responds really badly and then may make a poor choice about the next sort of tackle she puts in, or she may start walking. That's just where that player is at this moment. There's so much that can be developed around that. The same way, if the crossing wasn't consistent, you'd be like, okay, we need to work on that. It's really important that the areas that you're watching, you're seeing on the pitch, you remember that they're workable, they're trainable, and with conscious effort, it can be improved. Not that this is their character and this is just what they like. And that's probably the distinction I'd want to make.
Yeah. So, and particularly when we look at what we know about the brain and, it's never a blank slate and you're building on what has come before. That's kind of supports what you're saying, isn't it? It's about, this is where this player is at this time, and take it that it is at this time, and look at ways in which you can help them cope differently and use their resources and capacities differently, isn't it, to meet the demand?
Yeah.
So we're going to move on. We're going to move on to how we might develop it. And this comes back to what I was just alluding to there, which is the brain is never a blank slate. So if we want mentally tough and emotionally tough players, at the bottom of that, you need players that understand emotion and are aware of emotions. And that means the environments you create for players also need to have an eye to allowing emotions to be present and be learnt about. So the environment can be a real tool for you to develop mental toughness. We're not necessarily going to focus on that one in any great detail here, but there are a couple of other options around how you can develop it, depending on the resources you've got in terms of a psych resource, or whether it's you and your coaching team and doing it through in-game coaching. So we're just going to have a little chat about this. Mitch, so can you give an indication of kind of some of the stuff that you're doing around some of the headings here?
Yeah, I think these are things that you would probably see throughout the pathway on both men and women's programs. So I don't think they're specific in any way. I think you've raised a really good point. So one aspect that we need if we are developing sort of mentally tough behaviours is the access to psychological support. So if we are put in place under pressure, then they have that ability to tap into a psychological skills training model, for example. Obviously, the big challenge in any national setup and national teams is the time constraint that you have. So you automatically work systemically through the system, obviously, and the people within that system. So you've got coach behaviors on there. We've got off-field groups, so anything around team meetings that we would look at. So if we're trying to increase context knowledge, for example, so an awareness and understanding of what's required to achieve, that would be one dimension of mental toughness. Then we've got to talk to players about how we want to play and what the opposition might be putting up against us. So in order to pursue a goal, then we have a really good understanding of the context that we're going in terms of the game and the training week. And we can do that in small units. We know learning is quite difficult, sometimes in larger groups, and Claire will probably talk about this. So do we put smaller groups together where learning is more sociable? Do we go one-on-ones? Do we identify the players that we need to talk to on a one-on-one? So the managers and the coaching staff will do that accordingly. Through the analysts and the information that they have to give them, for example. So pressure in itself, you would hope, exists just coming in for England representation and high competitiveness of places. So pressure definitely exists, but any coach you speak to throughout the system is fully aware of how to increase that pressure through practice design and conditions within the sessions that they do. We can be fortunate enough to be involved in that planning, which is great, and they might bounce some ideas off us and we can challenge those. So our practice design is really tied around tact, physical and psychological, really. And then we really do understand how to perhaps foster some challenge and support or facilitative environment, maybe. So how do we do that, and how do we test some of the squads around perhaps grasswork stuff that's going on? So how do we facilitate that environment as much as we can to challenge and provide some adversity in a psychologically safe environment? So loads of ways to do it, but I think very consistent throughout the pathways from 15s to senior team. I think Claire would probably back me on that one.
Claire?
Yeah, most definitely. I think it's really, really important that we kind of have that consistency, but of course, like whether you're delivering this at grassroots or whether you're delivering it in an academy, your time may vary. And I think with the younger age groups, we tend to work within smaller groups just because we know how difficult it is for adolescent athletes, to kind of like speak in front of others, to kind of challenge others. It's a real difficult time for them to do that. So what it might look like with the younger age groups is on that walk down to training, just challenging two players, like, okay, right, we've got a real focus on 1v1s in this training session. Who's going to win? I'm going to be tallying it up. Who gets the better of the other one? Who's going to win from this? But then making sure either during the session or after the session, that learning is really facilitated. The challenge is always the catalyst for that learning, but the facilitation and the support after that to be like, okay, right, so you lost 3-1 there, or you lost 5-1 there. What did you learn? What could you have done different? How could you have calmed yourself down so you could think a little bit clearer during that situation to maybe solve the problem or adapt? Maybe you're a bit close, maybe you weren't giving him enough space, that sort of thing. But really supporting them to help develop after is absolutely key.
And then just one point around when we're thinking about what programs look like across the pathway. I mean, you're a very good, you're demonstrating well the connectedness of what it looks like at the age they first come in to then how it progresses up to, senior men or senior women, so I'm hearing you sort of saying, well, actually, there does need to be a conversation about what we're going after and why we're going after it in order to get a proper program of support across your, across your age groups. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Like I said, that they can move through that pathway at very differing rates, and particularly at first team, like you can enter into a first team environment very, very young. And so I think if you're not preparing them for what they're about to face, then you're not really picking the right stuff, and you're probably doing them an injustice if you don't prepare them for those situations. So exposure to what we know is going to come later, and that's where we're really lucky. We have a team where we all communicate all the time. So I've got an absolutely clear idea of what are the challenges the players with Mitch and the seniors face. And then I can work out, okay, what do I need to expose them to at 15, 16, 17s, 18s, 19s to make sure they're ready for that.
I think one other point is, certainly when I trained as a psych, it was, good old fashioned mental skills and their role, in, creating a really solid foundation for players, rather than going after, I'll say, the bigger constructs, the sexy, more bigger constructs around mental toughness, resilience, and all of those that have their place. But so would you agree that, going after some simple mental skills is a good start for the younger age groups before progressing up to the more, I suppose, game-based resilience and mental toughness capacities?
Yeah, absolutely. You've really got to start at those, the age appropriate level where they are in their brain development. You've really got to take that into account so that you can kind of build. It's more like stepping stones building up rather than just going straight in the top and be like, right, you've got to be here now.
Yeah.
And I think a point of particularly on that and the programs that we see is it isn't just about the players, so we have to incorporate that information with the coaches and the parents around the players, that support network, so they're very aware of what it is that they might be working on, but also the benefits of that and how we can perhaps embed that a little bit more through parenting and education, but also with coaches. So yes, classroom sessions are important at times, but actually we want to be training and testing this stuff out on the grass as much as we can. So can we support coaches within that work? And from our evidence and experiences, that's bread and butter, really.
Yeah, so it's helping the players get their processes, isn't it? Testing them out, then making sure the support is there to facilitate that getting better. And facilitating the coaches to do that work, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So a few recommendations, I guess. Mitch, do you want to kind of go through this in terms of, because this is related to in-game training, isn't it? And
I think absolutely. Yeah, I just think it's. I would see it as common practice, and as a lot would, but. The coaches that I work with or fortunate to work with, they say clear alignment to the game model is essential. So we can't come away from what players are going to be experiencing or exposed to on a game day. So we have to have that clearly fixed in our mind. What is it we're actually going after, and trying to define that as much as we can. Operational definitions are really important, but we've got to speak in the language of consistency, of MDTs, coaches, psychs, whoever's talking about this development or work. Then we've got to have a common language and platform to work from, obviously. Can we be deliberate at certain stages, and when's it safe to do that? When do we put adversity in? How long does it go on for? When's the best time to do it? If you've only got a 2-day lead into an international game, for example, and players are coming in on the back end of a highly competitive game program. So we've got to understand how we put those challenges in and where we put them in. And obviously the coaching behavior is king and power in the room. So we need to be really on the shoulders of the coaches and making sure that we can support them fully in any intervention work that they're putting in place. And one that Claire really spoke about, we talk about the sort of stress response when we are putting pressure into certain situations. Then the challenge is the catalyst, but it's the support and the learning environment around that is key. So I think we're in a very good position to support that sort of development and process around support and challenge. And obviously the feedback on observations. Can we can we deliver that in the most safe way, but also encourage curiosity and critical dialogue to a certain extent, because not many people are comfortable with that. But we know in order to get into some really good collaborative work, then we are going to have that conflict, but in a healthy and positive way. So can we get good, solid, objective feedback on what we're observing, but can we deliver that in a way that enhances and optimizes learning to the highest sort of level, really?
And just in terms of, so this is about developing mental toughness in our pitch sessions, yeah. Claire, what about the habit formation then, and the right hand side of this slide?
Yeah, I think this is something that, there's so much to think about when you're developing a session, and sometimes the psych side can get missed. It's easy to forget, but actually, really deliberately thinking about, okay, what challenges do I want for the different players? That's kind of right for them, and making sure this is something that's happening all the time in your sessions. It's conversations you're having all the time. It's planning time that you're putting in all the time around this, because actually we know if we want this to become embedded and we want change to really happen in here, it's so important to repeat. And I know I said this lots when we spoke before, but it can never be done enough. And I think the more you invest in this area, the better reward you'll reap from it.
Yeah, agreed. And also have some fun doing it, isn't it?
Yeah.
The psych stuff doesn't occur in isolation. It's just a lens to consider when you're putting stuff together, but will pay dividends if you invest time in it.
Yeah.
So just to conclude, I think we're all very much in agreement here about it's really critical that you know what you're going after, why you're going after it, how it fits with your, the philosophy that you have at the club, your context, and the game model. We would all say that the more you can know your players from all angles, particularly around their motivations, what their identity is, and what shaped them as an individual, you're going to find out more about what their capacities and resources are. The blanket approach, very pro, aren't you, Claire, on the individual here, isn't it? Different strokes, different folks. Go on.
Yeah, definitely. In the same way, all your players' physical development's going to be at different stages based on their development. It's exactly the same on the mental side of things. Different players are going to have different experiences and have had different exposure to different situations in their lives. So I think it's important not just to do a blanket approach, because you end up then challenging some players too much based on where they're ready for, but actually some players, the challenge won't be high enough, so they won't actually maybe be pushing their mental toughness and pushing their development in this area, because it just won't pass that threshold for them. So like you said before, really knowing that person and their experiences will help you get it right for the different individuals.
Great. Mitch, what about biases? How are they influential with all of this, do you think?
Yeah, I think it links into the characteristic work that we said earlier on. It's important, the two sort of aspects, the aspects from a common language and perhaps not biased in your opinion on certain players because you've experienced or seen some observations throughout the pathway maybe. So it could be that somebody might say, oh, this player chokes a lot, for example, but actually, it could be situation specific, and we got to be careful not to bias our opinion on that and labeling, I guess. But then also the biasing in terms of the work that we are going after. So just being careful that just because we are comfortable doing certain work, maybe around motivation and confidence, that we don't bias our intervention or approach around that. That we're really mindful that there are a lot of dimensions along mental toughness, resilience, all of the sort of aspects that we've spoken about. So we've, that point that you've said about player knowledge and insight, we as a psychology group have to have that information on players, whether it's club or international level, and then that transition over to the coaching staff hopefully won't bias opinion and will then enable a sort of more efficient and constructive and optimal intervention package to work with these players as individuals for the pressures that they're going to experience.
Yeah, and also knowing your own bias about, you might favour, certain psychological factors, mightn't you?
Yeah,
so it's just being aware of exactly, what is this for me, and actually what do I need to be aware of, so that the players get you equally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure.
And then the last point here, which is really important, which is about within your environment promoting psychological safety, particularly if you're going after putting adversity and bumps and putting pressure on players in a game situation. A couple of points to finish from you two about that in particular. So yeah, go Claire.
Yeah, I think this is something that's so important, is like, when you're putting people in this difficult situation, and what psychological safety really means is people feeling comfortable to take risks. And that might be, challenging themselves to try something different. It might be, challenging them to speak in front of a group, any of those things. But that's a major risk for young people. So they've got to feel safe enough to be able to do that. And even though you're putting that challenge in, they've got to know that that support's there to help them get better. So I think that's absolutely crucial. If that challenge is too high, then you're just not going to get players that are willing to really push themselves to help develop this area.
Yeah, brilliant. I'd agree. I don't think it's it's consequential, but it's not a punitive sort of space that we want to be operating in. It's a high learning environment where we are safe to challenge, and there's no fear that if anybody says anything, then it's going to go against them. We want players to speak up, to be curious, to challenge. Gareth has said that from the senior team, and it's right the way throughout the pathway. And so, we just need to be very clear that, in order to get there, to get these behaviours or players demonstrating these behaviours, then it's a safe environment to do so.
Great. Thank you both for your time and your insights. I hope you've enjoyed us talking around this really relevant and important topic. Stay safe. Thanks.
Great. Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.